It's been a whole week. Have you missed us? Welcome back to Tuesday. Coming up on Worlds Asunder.
One of the things I've been fascinated by is inexplicable signs. So if you get a sign that says, "Don't poop here," there's a story. You know what I mean? Like, that sign didn't just go there for no reason. And you look at it and you go, someone pooped one time. And then you start imagining, why?
We've read about far-off lands and adventures of heroes, but how do we elicit those feelings of excitement, tension, and wonder in others?
Creating new worlds in any genre might seem like a daunting task, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel for every story.
Welcome, weary writers, to the Book Career Network of podcasts.
My co-host is David Shadoin, better known as Shady. It's not just a descriptor, it's also his moniker.
And she's Haley H.Y. Gregor, your friendly post-apocalyptic wasteland elf.
Together, we've got enough published to fill a small shelf, but why should you listen to us? Because we called in some favors.
Our friends and colleagues, some of the best and brightest, join us weekly to bring you tips and tricks for your world building and character development. So, open up your ear holes,
Get out your pen and paper,
and get ready for us to tear Worlds Asunder. So I know we promised everybody last week that we were going to get Griffin Barber on to discuss the gritty and a little bit of the writing in the dark. However, Haley and I, prior to that, had previously engaged with WorldCraft Club and done kind of a crossover episode with them. They've finally been able to release their episodes, so this week we have James Horton and Seth Ring, myself and Haley, and we'll be doing Cockroaches and Nuggets with WorldCraft Club. Open up your ear holes and enjoy the ride.
Hello and welcome to the WorldCraft Club, a show for writers who want to create rich, immersive settings for their audience to come back to time and time again. I'm your host, James, and today we have a very special episode where we're going to be diving into the question, why can we just not shut up about world building? I think we're like 80 episodes deep in that, and I've invited some guests who are just as passionate about it as we are. So first we have for Shady. How you doing, Shady?
Yo, what's up?
Yo. And H.Y. Geiger. Sorry,
Geiger.
I keep wanting to call. I keep wanting to name you after the person that designed the aliens.
Yeah.
It's
HR,
sorry, I'm a big
right?
fan of that series. That's H.R. Geiger. Yeah. So H.Y. Gregor. I apologize.
No worries. I'm Haley. Hi.
I mean, it sounds right. It's true. But anyway, Haley and Shady join us from the World Asunder podcast as part of the Book Career Network, and of course we have season regular Seth Ring with us today. How you doing, Seth?
What's up?
I think we've been in our first season since we started. I don't think we ever...
Have we just not skipped
do it when we can.
to the second one? We should do that at some point.
We never did that. We should just officially announce season 2.
Season 2, starting today.
Yeah. Yes.
It's not.
The next
This
episode.
is still
This is
season
the
1.
finale
Next.
of season 1.
Yeah.
4 years of season 1, here you are.
We don't make concise statements. We need 20 hours of my voice on the internet before we're done. All right, so why can't we shut up about world building? I think this inevitably, I was actually thinking about this as I was driving, because Seth had posed the question, and I think the phrase from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy came to my mind. The spaceship floated in the air the way bricks don't. Was one of the most just abundantly clear statements of what I was looking at in a story that kind of made me go, oh, because The Hitchhiker's Guide is actually very unsettling, and it is genuine science fiction. It's sort of a bit of parody. It's got a lot of stuff going on in there, but that was a world that was broadly expansive and honestly got me thinking a lot about where this world could go, and albeit very silly, but that's also the reason I love the Dune movies, is because all the ships float like bricks don't. They're all at jaunty angles, and it's very weird sci-fi, and I'm like, yes, jaunty angles, get rid of the thrusters, I want inexplicable anti-gravity. But that's just me. How about y'all? World building, why are you obsessed?
Well, so we touch on Douglas Adams a little bit, because we one of the things that he stated outside of a book was like when you have technology that is so inexplicable to or doesn't cover enough ground essentially that you can understand it, it's essentially magic, right? He has that
Arthur C. Clarke.
Oh, that was Arthur
sorry.
C. Clarke. No, that's my bad. I'm an idiot sometimes. That's why Haley's my co-host, is to keep track of things for me. But like one of the things,
same deal for Seth.
You did bring back, you did bring one of my favorite lines out of Hitchhiker's Guide is, the whale is falling, has this whole self-identity crisis, and then figures out what it is, and then dies, and then the flower pot is just, oh no, not again, right? Where do you come up with that? Where do we come up with a scene like that? And part of it is, it's actually a quote that we put in our closer for Worlds Asunder, came from Futurama during Bender's God episode, where he goes, especially for us as like, because I kind of look at it more from the professional lens, not as much from the personal lens anymore, but it's you want to do just enough that nobody knows you've done anything at all, right? And that's where world building fascinates me, is like, where is that line? Where do we go? Like, how do I get a scene like that flower pot and whale scene? How do I get there? And then you got to know that there is, like, sometimes, we just think of the scene itself and we go, we'll solve the details later. And sometimes you have a whole backstory behind that you're going to explain later. And then you end up with that scene and then nice little, that hook, right? That's how you hook that reader, or how you hook, if you're DMing D&D adventures, you're hooking your players in, and that's like, to me, that's the magic.
Nice. Haley, what you got?
I think for me, it goes back to when I was that nerdy little kid, reading under the covers at night, and my mom would come in and yell at me and take the flashlight away. Books were always safe, and they were always a place that I knew that if I was having a bad day, or, if I was bored or whatever else, I could always go and there was always a good book. And for me, the foundation of creating worlds that people can really dig into, or the reason that books are comforting to so many people, or that we enjoy the movies that we do, is because of the world building. That is where it starts. Because if you can create something immersive, then you want to have a good storyline, you want to have good characters, but it's where you can create settings like Rivendell that you can really sink yourself into, and then it provides like the perfect backdrop for the stories that you're wanting to tell. I usually start with that in my writing, which is not the convention that's super popular these days. So,
I like that though. That's expansive. That could go places. Seth, what you got?
I think for me, it's really exploration. I was very fortunate growing up to travel a lot, and the question of what's around the corner or what's over the horizon has just always been one that has resonated in my soul. And like Haley, I've spent a lot of time as a kid in books because they were a very safe place, and they allowed me to sort of step outside of my circumstance, my immediate surroundings. And so learning to explore new worlds through stories, but then also matching that up to, again, this travel experience, and really understanding that, just like in these books, I can go to a new place or a new world. There are things around the corner here. There are horizons that I can't see beyond, and I wonder what's over there. And the mix of that, just creating this idea in the back of my mind that's never gone away, that, it looks like it's just a forest, but there might be a gnome inside there. Like, there might be something creeping around, a fairy flying, when I turn my head away, right, what's there? And I think that has really, that's really hooked me. But, I have to say, I really resonate with this idea of being fascinated by the craft of it, by being fascinated by, like, how do you actually put something together that evokes that feeling? We, James, we talk a lot about visitants and about core concept and about the feeling or the conceptual piece of a story, what we want to invoke in our reader, our visitant. And I think that both of these ideas of exploration and technical craft lean toward that very thing. Trying to give a reader something, or give a viewer something, or find a feeling ourselves.
Yeah, I think there's sort of like humans really like narratives, and I think it's why conspiracy theories are so popular. There can't be just no reason that something happened. There has to be a reason, so there has to be some sort of nefarious force behind it, and people will make stories for whatever. One of the things that I've been fascinated by is inexplicable signs. So if you get a sign that says "Don't poop here," there's a story. You know what I mean? Like, that sign didn't just go there for no reason, and you look at it and you go, someone pooped here at one time. And then you start imagining why. And you start looking around and you start piecing things together, and that's a really, really maybe very silly and reductive way to think about it. But I feel like that's what a lot of world building is to me, is sort of signaling that there could be a lot more going on here, but never actually telling me. I think half the problem I've got with a lot of modern media right now is just the quantity of it. I almost want them to just leave some stuff untold. Not everything needs an origin story for me. Sometimes I like to be like, oh, it's a weird guy. Wonder how he got there. And just be like, I want to think about that. That the joy for me was in thinking about it. I don't know if you guys saw Arcane season 2, but this whole thing of there's this line in it that says, perfection did not lead to happiness, only the end of pursuit. And finishing all the stories that are out there doesn't really make us happier, because the speculation's gone, and from the speculation came the joy. But the joy makes us go, what's around the corner? George Lucas, tell us, where did Anakin come from? We need to know. And it's but did we? Did we need that knowledge? Or could we have just speculated forever? And that's kind of that's what I think really drives me about it, and kind of what's sort of exhausting me a little bit. I think I was dicking around with this definition of world building the other day, and I just kind of pitched it at Seth. But I was I think world building is effectively a tapestry of incomplete stories. That's what I think it amounts to some degree. Things that are never satisfyingly resolved, but people can see it just along that horizon and kind of make guesses as to what's there, without necessarily being revealed completely in the story in any way that's satisfying. But I'm not sure about that, and I'm open to pushback.
You made an interesting point, though. Conspiracy theories, trying to explain things, right? That really, if we go back, even just a couple centuries, mythos, and we have our folk tales, we have fairy tales. We have used stories for a while to try and build out our own world. Right? True or false, however you believe, it's not. But the Romans and the Greeks all attributed different things to different gods, right? That was their way of explaining the world around them. They were literally world building to try and understand what was going on. And then, science in and of itself, we pursue answers with science, but there's a reason why science fiction has such a decent audience, and why it's stood the test of time as a genre. And it's because we can't answer everything. We can answer some things, and then we continue to build out the world around that with hypotheses. And sometimes they're untestable. Sometimes they're, we find answers eventually. Sometimes the technology catches up. But
so this leads to a really interesting question. Do you think that science has negatively impacted our ability to tell fantastical stories? Has it added a requirement to world building that didn't exist when nothing was explained?
Not at all. In my opinion, it hasn't ruined that ability at all. In fact, it's given us more tools, right? If we just think about the different 80s sci-fi literature that took place in what is now the present, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you can imagine they imagine so many things for us, and I'm still waiting on a flying hoverboard. Right?
It's coming.
Right? It could be.
So
But-
so do you think
ahead.
though that, or I guess to refine my question a little bit, because I think you're right. I think that knowing more hasn't necessarily impacted our ability to have expansive imagination. In a sense, it's enabled it. But do you think that it has fundamentally changed the way... I shouldn't... Sorry, let me phrase this properly. Has it fundamentally changed what we need in order to pass the sniff test, in order to have a story, have plausible deniability? Or not, that's wrong.
Plausibility?
Plausibility is absolutely what I meant.
I always can use more plausible deniability.
Yeah, me too. It's been on top of my mind recently.
No follow-up questions.
No problem. Yeah, want to know plausible deniability. Thanks. Ayla, what do you think?
I think for
Yeah.
some things, yes. Especially for people that are writing or creating worlds that are urban or real-world settings. I think culturally, people are probably more closed-minded. Because it's really easy to be able to point to different, scientific advancements and think, we have solved the mysteries of the universe. Therefore, why would we keep asking questions? I think that is something that's probably more common than it was, centuries ago. Because the biggest things, like, we understand gravity now. We know why the sun goes across the sky. We don't have to speculate about those kinds of things anymore. One of my favorite books that I read when I was a kid was about this cult that was essentially trying to bring back these like Cthulhu-esque kind of gods, because they said we had science and science destroyed our ability or our need to look to something, and then we became unruly. And so they were like, we need to bring these gods back to like restore, basically like rule, but also like give people something better to believe in, which was a concept that I thought was really fascinating. I don't know if I should name the book because that's like the big spoiler thing at the end.
Spoiler alert for a book we haven't named.
Yeah, sorry. But it's The Haunting of Elizabeth Cray by Chris Wooding, and it's a YA,
Gotcha.
kind of a steampunk novel, but it's alt history. So I would really recommend that one to anyone. But yeah, so I think that it has changed some things. But if I primarily write fantasy, and so I don't have to worry about being as plausible because I can, I can cut the tape, kind of.
Yeah.
I think there is. I think in some ways it's not even like technology or science, but the expectation of explainability.
Yeah.
Like, there's this idea like that. It could be explained. Like, if we dug deep enough. Like, and I think there's this expectation of rules that would meaningfully apply to things. Like, when I read Lord of the Rings, it's kind of like, well, how did Gandalf come back to life? What did he have to do that? Did he just get enough XP to make it happen when he killed the Balrog? And it's just like, people, they want rules, but it wasn't like, I just came back to finish my job. Like, that's really what happened, is he got sent back to finish the job. And, like, he's limited, but sometimes he does really powerful things, but that's because he has this role to play in Middle-earth. And, like, we're less amenable to those explanations. And, like, I could probably, with a brief search, find you 100 people on YouTube explaining the implausibility of the Hobbit's mailing system and the idea that you'd have that much literacy among a completely agrarian society that's openly xenophobic. But, like, we're not, like... You know what I mean? It's like there's this one of the words that we came to really like use, and Seth threw out a bunch of like sort of terms that we throw around a lot. So visitant was our like fancy word for somebody who's in a world. It was basically our medium agnostic term. So you're a reader, you're a player, whatever. You are a visitant into a world, and then this idea. We originally actually called it fairy cake because of Douglas Adams, the infinite perspective vortex. And we had this idea that at the middle of the perspective vortex was a piece of fairy cake from which they extrapolated the atoms from everything else. And so we got this idea that, like, you have this thing in the middle of your world where it's like, what would it be like if bears were even more dangerous? And, like, that's the world you create. And so, like, then that sort of is what you expand upon. It reminds me a little bit of like what you're talking about, Haley, with like your concept, where you're like, hey, I've got this thing I kind of want to write about, and you're almost like building your world before you're writing your story. And to me, that adds up. That makes a lot of sense, especially with like fantasy and science fiction. Like the Mistborn series would be a good example of like a fantasy that's like, you know, they really lay down some hard rules, like this is how the magic works, and then you compare that to something more mystical. Tolkien springs to mind, but then even comparing Dune as science fiction to other science fiction properties, like you compare it to The Expanse, very different vibes. Again, brick spaceships that float at weird angles. That was the first, when I saw that thing, Paul's walking along the beach and there's just a ship at like a weird angle with like no thrusters. I'm like, yes, make it come out of the water. So like that just scratched the itch for me. Weird sci-fi crap. I just love it. But even our science fiction has, to some degree, I think the expectation is less fictiony and more sciencey, you know, for it to some degree. I don't know if that trend's universal at all. And like, I also have tons of sympathy for Shady's point, like with the whole thing of like, no, actually we're learning so much weird crap about the universe right now that it's like, if anything, like it just gets weirder, you know what I mean? And like I like that too. I like kind of marrying those concepts.
Okay,
go for it, Zach.
so
see you
now I'm wondering, are we seeing a trend where sci-fi is getting weirder because we're learning so much about the universe and the world that when you actually pay attention, it just everything we learn opens up a million new questions, right? And in a sense, superheroes were this sort of this weirding of the world, where you're like, well, what if people had these powers, and what if they have, and then everybody gets one or a couple, and then there are just lots of them, and there are all sorts of different kinds of powers, and like every weird power that you can think of can exist in this space. And I wonder if science fiction is getting weirder because we feel like the world is getting weirder, and fantasy is getting less weird. It is getting more stable. It is getting more grounded. I don't know.
I think you can blame. I have a short. I think you can blame Brandon Sanderson for the science or fantasy becoming less weird, primarily because of Mistborn and a lot of his. So I haven't read a ton of his stuff, but I have read the Mistborn trilogy, and that book occasionally felt like I was reading an encyclopedia. It was that had such hard magic, as they call it, right? Like there were points where he was mixing different metals, and I didn't remember what they meant, and I had to flip to the back of the book to remind myself. And I think that was one of the first kind of hard magic series that became really popular. And I think that is now trending pretty intensely.
That's a good point. That's a good point. He really started a movement with that distinction of his understanding of hard and soft magic systems, and has really sort of infected the world to an extent.
That is a word, yes.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking especially. You do game lit, right? So it's like your worlds have to have rules that players can exploit to some degree. All right.
No,
fine.
But I understand what you're saying.
No.
All of my worlds have to have rules.
Yeah.
But they don't have to be explained. And I think one of the things that separates what you would call crunchy lit RPG from not crunchy lit RPG is this idea that there's either math involved or there's no math involved. They just leave the math out. And all of my stories leave the math out, right? And
you're playing Savage Worlds.
Yeah, essentially. It's very like, I write very soft systems. I don't write hard systems, mainly because I'm just not smart enough to like do that. I just can't keep track of it.
That's a lot of work, and I'm not sure the payoff is.
That's sort of where I landed.
You know,
and again, this comes back. So this goes to Shady's earlier thoughts about sort of the craft of world building being a fascinating thing, and like and pursuit of mastery when it comes to the tools that create good worlds. And I think that that's a really interesting thing to explore. Just because whether we're talking about hard systems or whether we're talking about soft systems, whether we're talking about fantasy, whether we're talking about science fiction, all of these different types of world building, kinds of world building, flavors of world building come down to a lot of the same tools, right? Understanding narrative, understanding immersion, understanding how to, hook somebody, understanding what to say and what not to say. So, and I hope I'm not throwing the conversation in too different of a direction, but I'd actually really love to get both of your takes on how do you pursue getting better at world building? Because this is a question I've been asking myself a lot.
For me, it's kind of the same thing that I do to just reset my muse in general, which is I will consume content, right? I either read, I watch TVs, movies, I listen to podcasts, I play video games. I currently both DM a D&D group and also play in a different TTRPG group. And all of that just like when I'm looking for an answer to something or I need inspiration somewhere, like for me that's how I kind of reset my mind.
Do you, if I can ask a follow-up question here, do you intentionally like pause when you see something you like and think about, okay, how did they do that? Or is it more of a passive absorption of sort of all the things and then using that to filter out what you want to do yourself?
It depends. Certain things I'll go, all right, that was a really cool thing. Now I got to figure out how they came up with it. Like I went through the entirety of the game Hogwarts Legacy, and it wasn't until I was doing something. I write a little bit for Gaxworks and do some of their adventures that Luke Gygax puts out for D&D, and I was trying to think of something, and one of the things in the first one that I did for them, I had just finished up Hogwarts Legacy, and I thought back through it, and I went, that was a really cool kind of like interruption idea. Now I'm going to think about it and come back to it and go, all right, that would be really cool to include in this.
Yeah. Like looking for tools and then finding a place to slot them in.
Yeah. And then making it fit.
Yeah.
You guys kind of brought up, I'm going to touch back on a point you made a little bit ago about science fiction getting weirder. But one of the things about world building for science fiction, right, is that we brought up Dune enough times. It is very focused on the characters. Yeah, right. I can keep going. It's very focused on the characters reacting to the world around them, right? If we switch POVs just slightly, or if we change up just one of the things about like any one of the characters or one of the events that occurs in the first book, we have an entirely different story, right? And Dune as you know it changes because of that. And that's one of the things that to me, or like even if you just switch POVs, you switch how you write it. Haley and I were both lucky enough to get invited to write in a space opera that is very character heavy, right? She talked a little bit about how she would write worlds out, and that's kind of how like Frank Herbert, J.R.R. Tolkien did it. But yeah, everything nowadays is very character based first and foremost, right? And we have two different distinct space trilogy or space series that, just because of a simple switch of what we're going to focus on, we've gotten very different stories from.
Yeah, I like that. Haley, what do you think?
Just
How
as
do you
far
recharge?
as going back as far as like how to
Yeah,
improve
sorry.
my craft and what I'm doing.
No, that's
Now I'm just
great.
making sure. I think that the most important thing is to foster curiosity.
Yeah.
And like that's the thing that we all have innately as kids, because Seth, when you were talking about like, oh, there might be a gnome in that tree stump. When I was a kid, I fully believed fairies existed. Like I read enough fairy tales and stories, and like Fablehaven came out when I was a kid, that I was like, for sure, fairies are real. And if I just do the right things and I go out into the woods behind my house, like I will meet one. And, you know, to some extent that never goes away, right? Like I'm hiking in the woods and I see something cool, and you still see those little things where you're like, wow, this mushroom formation is really cool. Or that tree is, you know, split in just the perfect way that there could be something there. But also just finding things to be curious about in day-to-day life. When we see those articles that are about this ancient sarcophagus that's been buried for 2,000 years and we're going to open it, and we're like, no, don't open
Yeah,
it. Don't
yeah,
open
please
it.
Don't
don't.
do that. Don't. No,
But
this
what-
is not the year.
Yeah, exactly. But what would happen if we did open it?
Right.
And so
Yeah.
I think constantly looking for those kinds of
mummy.
things is really important. Yes.
That's what happens.
I don't read ancient Egyptian,
seen
so
this.
I'm not at risk for that. But I think that like kind of having eyes open for those kinds of things is important. And then I have tried to be more critical in my consumption of media, because I am the kind of person who will sit down and watch a movie and just absorb into it to the point where I don't even think, like I don't guess about what's going to happen next. I just watch, and trying to pay more attention to what's popular and why, what works, what doesn't work, you know, what gets me excited when I'm watching a movie versus things that I think are not working. And so trying to be more analytical has been really useful for me. So.
Have you found that it's been a hard transition, or has it been
Yes.
something that you enjoy?
It's easier to do in books because they move slower. And so,
Sure.
and now that I'm a writer, I'm published. And so when I'm reading, often it's research reading.
Right.
And so it's a lot easier to break those storylines down and look at different world elements and think, this thing about the magic doesn't actually make sense. Am I okay with that? Because sometimes I am, and other times I'm not, because there's that level of suspension of disbelief. You have to decide where you fall on the scale. But with TV and movies, still, I'm like a little kid. I zombie out. I stare at the screen. And I'm not great at picking out the elements that I like. So I'm trying to be more conscious of that.
What do you think, James?
So just a whole lot of things. No, that stuff is fascinating. So me and my son, when we're ever wandering around outside, he is currently 5, and but he will be older later.
As they do. I have a
Yeah.
4-year-old.
It
So
keeps happening. I keep trying to squeeze him smaller, but it doesn't work, and
Yeah.
apparently I could go to jail. But I take
Plausible
him out
deniability,
and-
James.
Come on.
So what we do is when we ever go out and we're like walking around in like the forest or something, we'll take like little twigs and we'll start snapping them all into like equal sizes, and we'll make little fairy houses. And I've always just kind of liked the idea of somebody just finding that and going, what's this doing here? You know what I mean? It's just like one of those like sort of fairly implausible acts of creation that someone may not fully understand, and just kind of goes, maybe fairies are real. You know what I mean? Like it's like, just why would someone do that? I always kind of find that interesting. I have a tendency to be probably overly analytical in my approach to there's a lot of decompression that I do when I watch something. Like I just got done with Arcane Season 2. It was a very dense masterpiece, I think. And as I am now watching, like, I've got to be like I'm probably more hours into analysis videos on that than I am like content in the show, because I just really like to dive into stuff and I like to understand it fully, but I also get frustrated when people tell me things like A Series of Unfortunate Events, the children's series, is incredibly good at telling you nothing. And like I think that to me, the thing that I find funny is my joy in the show in these things comes from not knowing, and the term that we sort of use for it is wonder. And I think wonder is a very major motivator for me. Like the Watcher in the Water in Lord of the Rings is like an example I always bring up. A nameless thing that gnaws at the roots of the mountains, possibly disturbed by the Balrog. Is he under Sauron's thumb? We don't know. Seeking the ring? Possibly. Like, we don't know a lot. But forever locked in my mind is the flipping Weta Workshop guy describing it. I just wanted this giant sphincter to open up. And it definitely was a sphincter. But other than the sphincter, I don't know a lot about the Watcher in the Water. And I really liked that concept of these nameless things that gnaw at the roots of the mountain. And I like to imagine myself exploring that place and kind of thinking like, oh, what would it be like down there in the inky depths, you know, some sort of combination of like claustrophobia and thalassophobia at the same time. You know, it's like, and to me, it's like, I think about, oh, what made me think that? There's this comedian, Bill Bailey, and he claimed that he writes jokes by going, hoo-hoo-hoo. What would it take to create that kind of mirth? And like, that's almost like how I world build to some degree. Is I go, wow, that's a really scary thought. I bet that'd be really interesting to write about, you know, like, or to be there. And so like, that's a lot of like my approach, and ignorance is my favorite thing with it. It's just, I like to not know. And I hate being told, but I'll never stop searching until I find it. So like, I'm, you know, knee deep into wikis and lore pages, reading about like Warhammer, and like, not wanting, like, I've never played Warhammer. I just really like the lore. I've never even read one of the books. Like, I have no, I am more into wiki than I am anything with flipping Warhammer. But I like the fact that, you know, there's lots of mystery in that universe that never gets fully explained.
You've reached the end of yet another week of Worlds Asunder, this time with James, Horton, and Seth Ring, the WorldCraft Club guys. We hope you enjoyed listening to their takes on how world building works, how it affects them, and really what kind of drives them to continue talking about it, and learned a little bit of an insight of why we decided to host this podcast. I know it's a little bit of a different speed, different kind of take of an episode, so hopefully you enjoyed it. As always, thanks to Nick Thacker and Book Career Network for hosting us. Make sure to go check out WorldCraft Club and Seth Ring's websites in our show notes, as well as go check out our websites and follow us on any of the social medias. Next week, we'll be back with Cockroaches and Nuggets Part 2. Sitting back down with James and Seth so we can talk more about world building. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as give us a share so that way we can reach more ears. And thanks, as always, for helping us tear the worlds asunder. We'll see you next time.